Thanks, and thanks for this day already. It's been really fun, interesting listening to everybody. And I'm going to present a continuation of some of the work I've been doing for the past 4 years or so. And I'll present to you guys for the first time some data that I just collected this year. And so what I'm looking at for this work is just some changes in these propagation sawtest cut lengths following loading. And before I get rolling, I'd like to thank a few folks. Gabrielle, and I'm going to mess up Gabrielle's last name. But anyway, Gabrielle Antonioli. Close, maybe? She helped me with some of my field work, which was awesome. Alec van Herwinen has helped me with a lot of this work and does a lot of the analysis. He's from Switzerland. And then I got to thank Doug, Eric, and Alex from the Avalanche Center, especially Doug, the sheriff in town. The other sponsor that I need to thank, and those people who have followed my research know that I try and do things as cheaply as I absolutely can. And I was looking for a little stick to be able to put my signs on, so I went over to Ace and I was trying to buy pieces of lath and they didn't have any, and the gal says, "I think you need yardsticks." And I go, "Yeah, yardsticks would be perfect." And she's like, "How many do you need?" And I go, "I don't know, I need like 8 of them." So she hands me 8 yardsticks, and I said, "How much are these?" And she's like, "Oh, we're giving them away." So free yardsticks from Ace.
That's still going on?
Yeah, you know, you can get your free yardstick, and then you just need your cardboard, and you're all good to go. So I'm going to play this video, and this was a video that we took when we first started looking at loading some of these slabs, and actually Chris Bilberry shot this. Okay, so we're getting slab fractures. You can see that the slab just doesn't have enough tensile strength to communicate that fracture up, and so we're not propagating to end along that weak layer. So now we're going to do some modifications to the slab and see if that changes things. So now what we've done is we've got the same situation with the surface hoar, but we've put a load on top of it. Let's see what happens here. Okay, again, we're getting slab fractures. And what we did is, we added load to the whole situation. We added additional weight, but we didn't really add much structural integrity. So we didn't really, there was no real connection between this. Since we had these multiple blocks, it wasn't really increasing the overall tensile strength of the slab. And again, we were getting slab fracture. Now we've loaded up the slab, or we've loaded up our slab here with just snow that we put on with the shovel, because this snow, and then we've given it about 55 minutes to bond, to center up, with the idea that now we've added not only load to the slab, but we've also added tensile strength. And let's see if we get the fracture to propagate down. And we have propagation to end. So this time, the entire block fractured to end. And you can see that the slab, it's a fairly healthy slab that we got on top now, this layer that we put on there. Looks like it's about, probably 1 finger hardness or so. And that slab was enough then to communicate that fracture up the column and cause it to propagate to end. And so that's an example where you could have a buried weak layer, and maybe you put a thin wind slab over the top of it, and that weak layer is not reactive until you put that thin weak layer over the top of it, and now you've added enough structural integrity to the slab, and boom, you're getting propagation. And the next step in this was to see what happened when we added additional load. And it makes sense that loading is going to favorably change the snowpack for triggering, because we tend to more easily trigger avalanches immediately following loading. And so this work that I did, and I presented this at the last ISSW, really showed how as we added more load to the snowpack, then we shorten that cut length in your propagation saw test. Okay, and that propagation saw test, that cut length is really thought of, you know, that distance at which then it propagates to end. And so this shouldn't be too surprising. You know, we add more load to the snowpack and we end up with a shorter cut length. And if we look at some of the research that's been done, now I want everyone to memorize this equation because it's really important, especially Chabot. He likes equations. But essentially, you just need to look at this part down here. This is some stuff that came out of the anti-crack work that Joachim Heyerle did, and then was derived and updated with some of the work that Jörg Schweitzer did. But if we look at this critical crack length, it's proportional to your weak layer specific fracture energy, or just think of that as your weak layer strength. It's proportional to the elastic modulus, that's the stiffness of the slab. So if we have a stronger weak layer, we're going to have a longer cut length. If we have a stiffer slab, we're going to have a longer cut length. And it's inversely proportional to the load. So if we increase the load, we're going to expect a shorter cut length. And that's what those results showed. We increased the load, we had a shorter cut length. And then when we looked at the weak layer strength and the slab stiffness values using some particle tracking, which I'll talk about in a minute, those stayed about constant. So it was really that increase in load that was driving that decrease in the cut length. Well, I found this all really interesting because it started to help at least explain why when we load the snowpack, suddenly the snowpack is a lot more sensitive to loading. But the other part of the picture is that we know that after we load the snowpack, then it tends to stabilize. And so there's this whole time element that wasn't captured in that work that I thought, next year I want to go and I want to load the snowpack, and then I want to look at how things change over time. I want to look at how these different variables change over time, the slab stiffness, the weak layer specific fracture energy, and see how those relate back to the cut length. So that was really the driver behind this. And one thing that you need to remember is that these propagation saw tests are not avalanches, right? With a propagation saw test, we're really driving that fracture linearly along that one beam. But with an avalanche, that's being triggered more from the middle of the slope. You probably have some sort of radial transmission of that initial fracture out onto the slope. So it's not exactly the same. There's a lot more going on in a real avalanche. But we're hoping that by using these small controlled beams that we can gain additional insight into what's happening in actual avalanches. So, went back for the field area, went back to the mighty Bacon Rind once again, because that's the place that just produces these perfect surface ore layers all the time. And we're actually, this is the work that I did before, we're actually just right over the hill from that. It's really low angle area, about a southeast aspect, and the slope angle was 12 to 15 degrees, so pretty flat. We utilized this particle tracking velocimetry to analyze the fractures. So, you know, you'll see these different videos. They've got all these nice little black dots in them. Those are just little plastic cap ends or pipe ends. They're like this thick, and you can just push them all into the snowpack. And then we film with just your basic point and shoot camera, but one that'll film at 120 frames per second. And then I can ship these videos over to Switzerland. That's the good part. And Alec then can do the analysis on them, and he's written up all this code that will actually figure out what happens with each one of those dots at each one of those frames. So at 120 frames per second, it can measure displacement in any of those dots up to 1/10 of a millimeter. Okay, so you can get like some really nice images and really nice picture about what's going on when you have these fractures. So the methods we use were very similar. I'm going to see if I can tangle myself up here. The methods that we used were very similar to the stuff that I presented at ISSW, and I've presented at our workshop, so probably a lot of you guys have seen this. But really expensive stuff. We have cardboard from the recycling center. We have duct tape, and then we just simply take pieces of snow, usually stuff for a little bit lower in the snowpack, and you just rub it back and forth, disaggregate the grains. We've got nice little markers on the inside of this, and this is 90 by 30 or 100 by 30 centimeters, the size of a standard PST. And we disaggregate the grains, smooth that all out at a certain level. And in this case, we were adding 10 centimeters of snow. So all we did is we had a weak layer. It was buried about, I can't remember exactly, between 10 and 15 centimeters down. It was a layer of surface hoar. Fractures would not propagate on that. We were getting slab fracture. Then we'd put 10 centimeters of snow on top of it, and we were actually getting very short cut lengths just from that. And so what we did then was we did these all over the slope with this 10 centimeter height, and then we started a clock for each one and tested the snow actually over the next 4 days. So this is what it looks like when you do it. You're like, oh my God, how much digging? So, and one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how to, because when you load it, you need to load that whole piece of snow that you're then going to test to see how things are going to change. But you don't want to completely isolate it on all sides, because then you're exposing all the outsides of the column and the outside of the weak layer to your atmospheric conditions. So what I did was I left about 10 or 15 centimeters of snow around the whole column, and then used the snow saw and cut out, so I was isolating it. So it was isolated onto that snow below it, but it was still somewhat insulated from the atmospheric effects by having the snow around it. And I thought, well, it's possible that like some snow crystals could blow in there and help support it a little bit. So every day when I came back to the field site, I would go and recut all of them. And it didn't feel like there was much left in there, but I would just, for drill, I'd go around and recut every single one. And yeah, so essentially, went there on the first day with Gabrielle, and we made a bunch of these. And then the next day, and then tested some that were just an hour or 2 hours old. Then come back the next day, do your ones that are 24 hours old, make a bunch more for the couple days later, come back the next day, you got 48 hours old, you make a few more, and then you come back sort of that 4-day period, and you have a bunch from different days, and see what happens. So here's another video. See, there's... So we're up here on Bacon Rind, and what we've done is we've loaded 10 centimeters of snow. That 10 centimeters of snow has about, the density of it's around 350, and we've loaded that on top of an existing snowpack. That existing snowpack, buried about 15 centimeters down into the existing snowpack, was a layer of surface wood. And so we've loaded this, and then we're trying to look at how much time it takes for stabilization of that layer, or rather how all the different factors are changing over time that might lead to the stabilization of that layer. So we are doing these time frames as short as 30 minutes, all the way out to a day, 2 days, 3 days, and these right here have been 4 days. And what we've seen is that we have a rather dramatic increase in the cut lengths over the first several hours, and then that increase sort of levels off and becomes more gradual over time. So we'll show you a couple of videos here. So this is 3 different tests. This first one, it's only been there for 30 minutes. So this is 30 minutes after that load was applied and it was completely isolated. And we're going to get a PST cut length of 4. So right, boom. Okay. Now essentially the same sorts of conditions. This one is 3 hours, and our PST cut length has gone up to 12. Now this one is, I think this one's 4 days with the PST, yeah, 4 days, PST cut length of 24. So you can see you have like pretty dramatic increases immediately, and then it levels off a little bit. And I'll show you a graph of that in a second. And there you go. So
Generally nice, sunny, warm days, cold days?
it was actually ended up being perfect conditions. It was a couple of the days, I think 2 of the days were cloudy. There was never more than like a couple of new snowflakes on the skin track, you know, so we weren't adding load. That was one of the things I was worried about. I didn't want to add any additional load to the snow. And it wasn't warm enough to ever have water, like there were no crusts being formed or anything. I'd say the overnight lows were, I mean, it was fairly chilly, you know, overnight lows probably around 5 or maybe even a little bit lower. And then, you know, most of the sampling days, I'm sure were like around 20, something like that. Yeah. Or maybe even a little colder. So this is what it looks like. You know, immediately we're having this pretty rapid increase in our cut length, and then that rapid increase tends to, you know, level off, but it's still increasing over time. We might be having 2 different mechanisms for that increase. I'm not sure. And we haven't analyzed the particle tracking data yet, so we don't have some answers. But one of the things that was really interesting was I collected this data set. I was hoping to collect several of these this year, but we just didn't have the right conditions for it. And you know, we collected this data set, I graphed it up, I sent all this stuff to Alec over in Switzerland. He's like, wow, that's really cool. And he goes, have you looked at that paper that I did with Dan Miller? And I was like, oh, I should look at that again, you know. And in that paper, they cited some work. This was a paper that I'll also talk about, but they cited some work by these 2 folks, Hobbs and Mason, who way back in 1964 they were looking at sintering rates, and they were looking at bond to grain ratio, and they said that should change according to a power law with a power law exponent of 0.2. And Alec and Dan Miller had looked at sintering rates using the SMP, and they were actually looking at the penetration hardness increase of these slabs for up to 8 hours, and they had power law exponents of anywhere from 0.07 to 0.28, but most of them clustered right around 0.2, which was pretty cool. Because in Alec's email he said, wouldn't it be amazing if you graphed that on a log-log plot and you came up with 0.2? And then he told me that they had a master's student at SLF, and they were looking at the changes in the elastic modulus. Now, elastic modulus, like I said, that's your slab stiffness. And so he's using acoustic wave propagation to look at those changes in elastic modulus. And these were basically beams built this same way. They were disaggregating snow and then looking at the changes. And that had a power law exponent of 0.24. And so I go back to my data. I plot it on a log-log plot, and then I calculate the power law exponent, and lo and behold, it's 0.24. And as Alex said, well, it's great to see that the laws of physics still hold in the U.S., because not much else does. So, but what this does is it suggests anyway that one of the big drivers that I'm seeing, at least in these data, is the stiffening of that slab. So as that slab stiffens, that increases your cut lengths. I'm not so sure that we're not also having weak layer strengthening, and we're going to know more once we're able to analyze those videos. So, why do we have increases in cut length? I think a lot of it's slab stiffening, but it's also that strengthening of the weak layer. So it's more likely it's both going on simultaneously. And when you actually think about this, the bottom line is that we do see those increases in stabilization over time, but that rate of increase of stabilization is highly variable. I mean, we know that from our avalanche forecasting. We know that from looking at the snowpack. And so I think it's really going to depend on the weak layer, the load, how much load's added, you know, the type of slab, et cetera, et cetera. So it's probably going to be really dependent. And with that, I'll just say thanks. And any questions? Or comments? Zach?
Maybe more just comment. Hopefully I don't have to deal with this in the flathead anymore, but we see our slabs facet away pretty quickly and actually decrease in stiffness but improve stability.
Yep.
And I assume it makes our cut lengths, we don't do a whole lot of PST, but would make our cut lengths longer.
Well, the increasing, you know, if your slab's becoming less stiff, then your cut length should become shorter, all other factors being equal. But probably what's also happening at that same time is you're having age hardening of the weak layer. And so since that age hardening of the weak layer, you might not actually observe a decrease in the cut length, but you might see an increase, for example, in ECT end results or PSTs that slab fracture. And, you know, we had a trip, well, Kevin and I and Ethan and a bunch of folks, Ed had a trip up to Canada this last year. And it was a really interesting week because at the start of the week, we were just 2 days removed from people remotely triggering avalanches. And that week was super, super cold. And we started to fast at the upper part of the snowpack. So the first couple of days that we were up there, we were getting ECT, like all the ECTs that we did propagated. And I'm not sure if we did many PSTs, but the ECTs were all propagating. But by the end of the week, the ECTs weren't propagating anymore, and the skiing was getting better because some of these wind slabs were faceting out, and the snow was becoming quite a bit more stable. We went from a period where it was really unstable to a period that it was a lot more stable, just in terms of like all the other operations around us and everything. And I think it was exactly what you're talking about. You facet out that slab, the slab becomes weaker, not as capable of propagating a fracture, and there you go. So there's lots of ways to get that snow to stabilize. That's one.
And you won't have to worry about that on the flathead because it's just going to rain.
Ouch. Other, yeah.
Do you see, or were you able to observe any settling over days? Like, did your weak layer thin, the surface soil weak layer thin at all, noticeably?
You know, it was interesting because in that first 24 hours to maybe 48 hours, especially that first day, like it was super easy to find that weak layer. You just run your hand and you're like, oh, there it is. And by the time the thing had sat there for 4 days, it was a lot harder to find that weak layer. And, you know, I don't have measurements of it, you know, but my feeling is that probably there was some settlement. It was harder to find the weak layer with the saw. Like on a few of them, the saw would roll a little bit, but on the first ones, it was so easy because that saw just wanted to follow that weak layer. So yeah, I think that is happening. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting was that, you know, immediately after we built those slabs, even 30 minutes later, the density of that thing was about, I don't know, 340, 350. And 4 days later, the density was like 350, 360. You know, I mean, it was, the density of that thing was similar, but it was interesting. It was, you know, after 30 minutes, it was probably a one finger plus. And then it went to, you know, by three hours, you're up to pencil. And at the end of that period, you're up to like pencil plus. So there's a lot going on in those first few hours, as we know, because, I mean, stuff's getting loaded right now, and it's really touchy, and maybe if you hit it like that next morning, it might not be touchy, you know, that kind of thing. So, and all, you know, and it's one of those deals, too, where you have all these different variables all changing at once, so it's hard to, you know, it's hard to get your hands around it sometimes. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
So on your data, would you say like 3 hours is kind of the cutoff where it spikes sharply and then after 3 hours it planes off, or do you not want to assign like a specific
Well,
to that, or did you do it at 4, 5, 6 hours?
yeah, we did it out to 6. So let's see. So these data right here are the first 6 hours.
Okay.
Okay? And then it's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. So what we realized was that we're going to have to go winter camping because we want to somehow fill in this, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the plan. You know, get Chabot out there, brewing up every hour and doing a bunch of tests. So well, that's hopefully, you know, that was what we were hoping to do this year, and we just never, the conditions didn't set up for it. But if we have the right conditions, I'd really like to do that. Yeah, but yeah, here's that first little bit, and you can see it's starting to go, and it's starting to, you know, curve a little bit. But you know, you can ask yourself too, like, well, is that stabilizing or not? We don't know. I mean, your cut lengths are still 15 centimeters. I mean, even out here, they're still 25, right? So they're still within that range that you would say would be an unstable PST result. But it's starting to give us an indication of how these different variables change over time and what might be involved in stabilization. Yeah.
Yeah, and that weak layer is close to the surface too, so
Yep.
you might be seeing more rapid change closer to the surface, whereas if you're dealing with a persistent,
Yeah, if you, well, and also we're dealing with a slab that was so weak, we couldn't even, you know, it was slab fracturing. So if you have a slab that's buried, well, and there's one thing too that we tried to do later in the year. Doug and I were there and we had, how much was on top of that? Like 70 centimeters or something? I think we had 70 centimeters on top of that weak layer, and we were like, and I thought, you know, there's no way I could make a big enough slab on top of that to make a real difference. I mean, what we ended up doing was, with shovels, we took our 70 centimeter thing and lifted it up and popped it on top, and now we suddenly doubled the load, and we saw a decrease, but still our cut length was like 25, and it just, yeah, it wouldn't really work, you know. So when you have something that's like you guys get, you know, some big hard slab sitting on a weak layer way down there, it's not going to feel much, you know, it's really not. But if you load up those shallow areas and get that started there, then that's where it's going to come out and take that thing out. Yeah. Yeah.
Here's, so you look at exclusively at surface form layers, these layers, and I'm curious if you think the same result, if you get the same result, if you're looking at a different kind of weak layer, maybe about faceted layer, something maybe smaller, it's not so easy to see, where you're going to have so much collapse.
Yeah.
I don't know, is that something?
I don't really know, you know, whether you'd see that or not. I mean, I know with the building of the weak layers, the work we did before, you know, in all case, we had some layers of smaller facets, some depth hoar, and some surface hoar. The biggest, you know, in all cases, as we added additional load, our cut lengths decreased. The biggest problem with some of the depth hoar and other layers is just it's harder to follow with your saw, you know, but the results were similar. But I don't know about, you know, about this stuff. If we get the right layers, though, we just, you know, this year we just didn't get that many good layers. I mean, it was just too damn stable. And just like John hoping for persistent weak layers for the people out on Saddle Peak, you know, I'm always hoping for nice weak layer formation. Right on.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah.